So from my perspective, Israeli allegations have a long history, a long pattern of turning out to be lies. Israel will no more voluntarily agree to allowing the people under its control to democratically choose how they are governed, in what state configuration or state's configuration that they are governed. Then it will voluntarily choose to agree to a two-state solution.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everybody. This time around, we're talking the Israel-Palestinian situation. One of the issues that hasn't been covered as much, I think, is the geopolitical, the security, is the just human rights element to this. But to talk about that with me, Leah Whitson. She's an American lawyer and the executive director of Democracy for the Arab World, or known as DAWN. And she was previously the director of the Middle East and North Africa division of Human Rights Watch. And we first encountered one another during a debate you were having on X on Twitter. And I just thought, maybe as an opening question, what is your general take of what you've seen in the past 6-7 weeks from a human rights perspective, and just the way things are going now with the Israelis' activities, occupation, operation in Gaza?
I guess if the starting date is October 7, what we saw then was a massive attack on civilians, a massive attack on Israeli civilians and military units by Hamas. And the attack on civilians breached all norms of international humanitarian law, and the most basic principle of which is not to deliberately target civilians. And since that October 7th attack, we have seen Israel violate every basic norm of international humanitarian law. And particularly the main principles, again, number one, do not target civilians, do not deliberately target civilians. And number two, do not indiscriminately attack civilians. And on both those fronts, Israel's bombardment and siege on Gaza has been a very clear violation of standards of international humanitarian law.
Now, you mentioned obviously the fact that this doesn't just start on October 7th, and I think it is something that not enough people like to really admit from certain sides of the argument. If they are ardent supporters of Israel, they don't really like to discuss the feeling amongst Palestinians that there's an encroachment of settlements in the West Bank, that they've been treated as though they're in an open-air prison, to quote people I've listened to as well. How far back should people go to really begin to understand this? 1948, the Balfour Declaration, hundreds of years? To what extent are we talking about between these two sides?
I think in terms of what is politically and legally relevant at this moment in time, 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, the war that accompanied the establishment of the State of Israel are the relevant starting points, because it was in 1948 that the Nakba, the mass displacement of Palestinians, forced displacement of Palestinians took place. And many of the people in Gaza today are, in fact, from mainland, what is today mainland Israel, established in 1948 in various parts of what is considered by much of the international community as Israel proper, and they became refugees in Gaza. Many people in Gaza still have the keys to their homes in various parts of Israel, in particular Jaffa and other parts of Israel. Since then, and formally since 1967, when Israel occupied these territories as the outcome of the 1967 war. Gaza, as well as the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights have been occupied territories. And other than Golan, make up the occupied Palestinian territories, which means that it is in a state of war. Occupation is a form of a state of war. And rules apply during occupation, which requires the occupying force to be responsible for the safety and well-being of the occupied population. So even though Israeli forces, physical forces, withdrew from Gaza, they remain, as a matter of law and as a matter of practice, the occupying power because they control all of Gaza's borders, airspace, seas, entry, access, the population registry. And so nothing can happen in Gaza without Israeli permission and control. In 2006, there were local elections in Gaza and the West Bank, and Hamas was elected in Gaza to govern Gaza as a unit of territory within the Palestine Authority. And following that, Israel imposed a siege, a blockade on Gaza to punish the population for having elected representatives from Hamas to govern the Gaza territory. There have been no elections since. There have been no elections since in the West Bank, and there are a variety of reasons for that. But mind you, the powers of the governance authorities, whether in Gaza or the West Bank, are very limited, more akin to municipal powers, sanitation, education, health, and so forth. Hamas does have an armed wing, and that is the armed wing that launched the attack on October 7th. But for the purposes of this discussion, the people of Gaza have been under Israeli military occupation since 1967. The territory has been subject to siege and closure of various degrees since 2006. Multiple efforts to break the siege have failed. There have been multiple wars in Gaza, with Israelis bombarding Gaza to respond to or otherwise target Hamas or other Palestinian armed groups in the territory. And the October 9 attacks are the latest Israeli war in Gaza, and by far the most massive death and injury toll that we've seen there. But it is for those reasons that I think the appropriate starting point is 1948.
There are obviously people who are going to vehemently disagree, now, and one of those is going to be a lot of Israelis. But I guess the question I would put to you about that is, though, is this not something that the Palestinians themselves sort of endorse? A lot of Palestinians in Gaza support Hamas. Or is that, in your opinion, more to do with the fact that they've been treated in such a way by the Israelis that they feel Hamas is the only entity that represents their interests, more than the Fatah political movement, more than sort of the PA in the West Bank has done? I know Mossad is pretty unpopular these days, but do you not think that there is an alternative to Hamas that would be more constructive to ensuring the Israelis don't respond in such a heavy-handed way as they have?
First of all, I don't think anyone really knows what the majority of the voting age population in Gaza wants, because there's not been an election since 2006. There are people who are a voting age today who weren't born when the last election took place. And so I don't know if we know what the majority of people in Gaza want. The most important thing to know is that the majority of the people in Gaza are children, and they have absolutely no choice in the matter of who governs them. The Palestinians in Gaza have no choice about Israel's occupation of their territory. Clearly, I would say everybody opposes the Israeli occupation, and they have no choice in who governs the municipal functions, let's say, in Gaza, which is currently Hamas, de facto by default Hamas. But whether that would be a choice in a democratic election remains to be seen. I think the real point to keep in mind is that the notion of there being elections in Gaza or in the West Bank is all really a bit of a facade and a fiction. The Palestinian Authority under Fatah rulership has no meaningful power, and it exists at the mercy of the Israeli government. Even its functions, such as health and education, are routinely interfered with by Israel. there was a notion under the Oslo Accords to create this fiction of Palestinian local governance, so that it would ultimately develop into a negotiating counterpart and so forth. That has always been a fiction and a charade because the Palestinian Authority has no real power. The only power that matters in terms of international law, in particular, is Israeli sovereignty over the Palestinian people. And so, what we actually need is to break out of this perspective of seeing Palestinians as a bloc and Israel as a bloc, or Israelis as a bloc, but rather consider, if Israel is the main sovereign governing over all of the lands between the river to the sea, then under basic democratic principles, under basic principles of equality, everybody should have a democratic voice in how they're governed. And that is not a government in which any Palestinian in the occupied territories has a voice in, that being the government of Israel. So what we have to look at is, how is Israel performing vis-a-vis the individual human beings under its sovereignty, whether they're Palestinian or Bedouin or Armenian or Jewish Israelis or Ethiopians or Sudanese? And is it respecting the rights of the people under its sovereignty? That should be the focus of our attention. We can't treat Palestinians as a block of humanity any more than any one of us would want to be treated as a block, without our say, without our vote, without our representation. Each individual human being, each adult, deserves an opportunity to make a democratic choice about how he or she is governed. And that is something that Palestinians have been deprived of forever.
Now, in terms of polling, I recall that there have been some polls done that illustrate sort of between 45 to 55% of the Palestinian population in Gaza do support Hamas. The last one being, I think, 2021, which was about 52%. I don't know how accurate those polls are. A lot of skepticism from the Israeli side is put on about the health figure, the casualty numbers that the health ministry of Gaza comes out with, because it's like, well, they're governed by Hamas, therefore these numbers are inflated. But my counter argument to that is, if you look to the Gaza war, the 50-day war of 2014, the Gaza health ministry came out with about 2,300 fatalities, of which the UN then cross-referenced about 2,200. So it does seem there's a degree of consistency there. The Israelis also said it was around 2,100, but the difference was that the combatants percentage was much, much higher in their opinion versus the Gaza Health Ministry. So how do we go about actually facilitating in your mind, accurate information, setting aside long-term prospects, which I want to come to in due course? How do we actually sort of ensure that the information that is coming out is accurate, even if it is Hamas or whoever is governing these areas?
Yeah, I'll put aside the polling data because the polls I've seen, I mean, they're laden with inaccuracies, and the way the question is asked dictates the answer, and you really have to look at what the questions were, who was surveyed, and so forth. On the health figures, on the mortality figures, the casualty figures in Gaza, the U.S. State Department has relied for many years on Hamas health ministry figures. The UN relies on these figures. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty has relied on these figures in the past, and they've always been accurate. So we have no basis to suspect that Hamas is now delivering inaccurate or misleading information. But the best way, of course, is the one way that Israel won't permit, and that is to allow independent investigators, independent aid agencies, independent journalists into Gaza. But Israel won't permit that. Israel, as I said, since 2006, has shuttered Gaza and made it so difficult, close to impossible, for independent journalists, independent human rights investigators, much less the International Criminal Court, much less the UN Commission of Inquiry, to get access to Gaza or even to Israel. So there is a deliberate effort to hide the facts and information, to hide the catastrophic death toll. I'm sure quantum measures more the injured death toll, but that is the deliberate intent and policy of the Israeli government.
So, what about then, just to be to continue this line of thought a little bit further? At the time of recording, obviously, quite a few significant degrees of footage have come out about Al-Shifra Hospital and the extent of the tunnel networks underneath it. First question related to that: what are your thoughts on those pieces of footage? Is it something that is just simply propaganda or information warfare from the Israelis to boost their narrative, or is there some degree of legitimacy? And second, do you not find it problematic? People on the other side also argue that because Hamas seemingly have been in charge of these hospitals, and the UN and other charities were working in such places, that they must have been aware of the situation and how Hamas garnered these. What are your thoughts on that as well? The sort of the complicit, them being basically complicit, I guess is what I'm saying. I can repeat either question if you need me.
Let's start. There's two questions here, but let's start with the micro and then go to the macro and see if you think it's fairly responsive. First of all, on Al-Shifra Hospital, the claim the Israelis made repeatedly, and that the U.S. State Department once again parroted unquestioningly, was that there was Hamas command and control headquarters beneath the Shifa Hospital, and nothing that the Israeli government has put forward to date in terms of its supported evidence or the videos and so forth does anything to corroborate that claim that they have made. To date, we have seen no evidence of any kind of command and control headquarters beneath Shifa Hospital. From the images that I've seen and that have been circulated, there was some guns that they found. I think less than a dozen. Maybe some uniforms. I think that they were stacked up. I
Half a
didn't see a
dozen
good count.
Kalashnikovs
Half
and
a dozen
uniforms.
uniforms.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay, half a dozen. And a shaft, a picture of a small hole in the floor that they say was leading to some tunnel. A shaft, for people who don't understand, and it took me a while to first understand this when I was focusing on these issues back in 2004 and 5, is that a tunnel is basically a horizontal hole in the ground. And it has multiple shafts that connect down to that main hole. And a shaft is, like an entryway into, think of a staircase or multiple staircases that lead to the same hallway. So the fact that there may have been a shaft underneath is no surprise, because as Ehud Barak discussed recently on Christian Amanpour's show, the Israelis built that shaft under the hospital. The Israelis had an extensive underground network, which Ehud Barak has confirmed. They put the shaft beneath the hospital. So again, that is not evidence of any kind of a command and control headquarters beneath the hospital. And if anything, it was something that Israel built. Obviously, Hamas soldiers have been not just killed, but injured. They are entitled to seek medical treatment at a hospital. Injured patients, injured soldiers are not legitimate subjects to attack. So again, in terms of the claims that Israel has made to justify its relentless bombardment of the hospital, it has failed to produce the evidence to support its claims. Now, the story could end there. Let me just go to the macro point. But for while we are debating whether or not there was something beneath Al-Shifra Hospital that would make it a target, or something beneath Al-Ahli Hospital that would make it a target, Israel has bombarded over 15 hospitals and medical centers, not even bothering to claim that they were being used by Hamas for military purposes and so forth. So let's not get distracted and lose our focus from the sight that the reality is that Israel has conducted widespread attacks on all of the hospitals in Gaza, such that there are only one or two, the number keeps changing, even able to operate now. So that's the other thing. The third point I will make is, again, drawing on the macro, having documented and investigated numerous Israeli wars and numerous Israeli Defense Force claims that accompany these wars. They repeatedly, routinely, without substantiation, allege that a civilian site is being used for military purposes, and that's why they target it. And these claims routinely turn out to be false. So, from my perspective, Israeli allegations have a long history, a long pattern of turning out to be lies, just like the lie that they repeated and repeated and repeated that Israeli forces didn't kill Shireen Abu Akleh. And there are many, many, many such cases. So you got to marry these three elements of fact together, I think, to come up with an analysis of Al-Shifra Hospital and the credibility of Israeli claims about Al-Shifra Hospital.
Right, so two counterpoints then, and another thought I'm curious for your thoughts on. But counterpoint one. So people argue that the Al-Shifra Hospital is massive, and it's going to take a long time to excavate, examine, and find every single nook and cranny that may well be illustrative that this was a stronghold for Hamas. Second point is, on that fateful day, the people argue that they passed, several other hospitals that if it was truly about medical care and attention, why didn't they go there? They took them to Al-Shifra because it's the stronghold and therefore they wanted to keep them there. People have also said that in times of trying to visit the hospital, apparently from first-hand accounts, there were parts of the hospital that you could not go to because otherwise you would be, quote, threatened and possibly, shot. So this was clearly places that Hamas were operating. And also, isn't it exact? This is the problem, and this is a theme I want to come to after this exchange, which is the dynamics of security and intelligence versus the protection of human rights and civilians, right? Which is that surely Israel aren't going to release every single piece of information to the public that they have about the hospital because it compromises operations elsewhere. So could it not be the case that they do have evidence to unequivocal evidence to show that this is something that they claim it to be, and therefore we just have to wait? Or you don't agree with that premise?
I can't speculate about unknown evidence that may exist in the universe, right? Is that Israeli claims repeated uncritically by the United States that this was a headquarters command and control center beneath the hospital have not been proven, period. That is the critical factor. I can't speculate as to unknown evidence that has not been revealed, but if it's a major command and control headquarters that they had knowledge of, and the reason for their strike, then it shouldn't be that hard to find it, right? So I'm not at all persuaded. They wouldn't have rushed to show us what they did find if they were so confident that there was anything else there. I think your second point is, well, maybe there are security reasons they don't reveal this command and control center. They're in full control of the hospital. So no, that's not plausible either. There could be a variety of reasons why patients were taken there later rather than sooner. They might have been hit in the course of week 2 or week 3. So I think that's just way too speculative to guess about. It's not something I would guess about.
But there's the emphasis is, though, from the Israelis that they have video footage, security camera footage of them rushing into the hospital, undeniable proof that they skipped all the other hospitals that they could have taken them to for healthcare and medical checkups and just taken them straight to the hospital with cots. So the Israelis are arguing that that is unequivocal proof that this was a place that they were taking to, or you still don't think it's strong enough because the Israelis could have lost?
I have no idea. It could be because Al-Shifra Hospital is closer to where they wanted to ultimately hold them. Crazy to try to surmise from that fact pattern any kind of evidentiary confirmation. And I've seen this movie before many, 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 many times.
Well, your book, when it's released, hopefully we can get you on to talk about that in more depth. Got a lot of different perspectives, and I think that this was a very important thematic one to cover. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next episode. But take care, everyone.